Good morning and welcome to the Sunday Politics. So, after protracted negotiations, David Cameron has finally named the day when voters will decide whether or not the United Kingdom remains part of the European Union. Put June the 23rd in your diary. The Prime Minister said the country would be safer, stronger and better off by staying in a reformed European Union on the terms he agreed with EU leaders in Brussels late on Friday night. But about a quarter of the ministers who sit with Mr Cameron in the Cabinet don't agree. They've said they'll campaign for the UK to leave. We'll be talking to one of those wanting out, Leader of the House of Commons, Chris Grayling. We'll be deliberating over which way this man will swing. The Mayor of London has apparently been agonising over his decision, although all the smart money's on him supporting the Leave campaign. And what of Labour? The party wants to stay in the EU, arguing it will be better for jobs, security and investment. We'll be joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Hilary Benn. And with me, three of Fleet Street's finest who've survived the negotiation process. They're looking well. Nick Watt, Melanie Phillips and Tom Newton-Dunn. Welcome. So, David Cameron's done a deal and named the date. Not everyone's convinced. Even one of the Prime Minister's best cabinet buddies, Michael Gove, has decided to campaign on the Leave side. Both camps, those who want to stay in the EU and those who want to leave, have come out all guns blazing this morning. Let's hear what David Cameron had to say on the Marr Show a little earlier.
If we remain in a reformed EU, you know what you're going to get. You know how to do business. You know how to create jobs. You know how to continue with our economic recovery. If we leave, 7 years potentially of uncertainty. And at the end of that process, you still can't be certain that our businesses will have full access to the market. So it could cost jobs. It could mean businesses, overseas businesses, not investing in Britain. It would be a step into the dark, a real risk and uncertainty. And that's just the last thing we need in our country right now.
The Prime Minister there. Well, let's talk now to the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. And Laura, the tone and the language has changed. That was fighting talk from David Cameron yesterday. All the reports from you and others were about a convivial cabinet meeting, everyone friendly, honest, open. Now, of course, the gloves are off.
Indeed, but it was also described by Theresa Villiers, who's of course one of the ministers for Out, as being very emotional. And I think now today is the first time we're going to see those gut emotions really spilling out into the public domain. As you said, the Prime Minister has sort of moved into this very campaigning language, that fighting talk as you described it, because the stakes are so high for him. He knows fine well that he's taking a huge gamble with his own leadership. He's taking a huge gamble with the country's membership of the European Union, which he always said he might in the end argue to leave, but very few people around here actually believed that. But of course the other thing he's taking a gamble with is his own party unity, and that fighting talk that we've heard from him today on that is still in part a last-minute plea to those waverers to get on his side rather than going to the other. You know, this is something we're going to see play out, perhaps very dramatically, this kind of blue-on-blue action. Cameron isn't going to stand up and debate directly with people who are opposing him, so he's doing that through another way. And one other thing that he said to our colleague Andrew Marr this morning was really quite strong and a bit, perhaps, bit sharp maybe. He suggested that those, including perhaps Boris Johnson, who wanted to campaign for Out, were linking arms with George Galloway and Nigel Farage. Now, for most people in the Conservative Party, that's hardly a compliment.
What about the waverers, as you have said? Boris Johnson, for example, I mean, he wasn't able to persuade with George Osborne Michael Gove, a very close friend of his, and that would have come as a blow. But how big a blow will it be if Boris Johnson does decide to campaign for Out?
Well, I think one of the things about this is people wonder, why do some people in the media seem to be so completely obsessed with one politician? And the reason is this: it's not very often that politicians have single name recognition. It's not very often, as if we do from time to time, you go out campaigning with politicians to see them in action. If you do that with Boris Johnson, people come out of their houses, they come out of their businesses, they come out of their shops, they want to see him, they want to talk to him, they want to have pictures taken with him. He is a rare politician, the kind who can actually add real fizz to a campaign and cut through to the public. Now, some people love him, of course, some people despise him, but the point is his addition into the Out campaign, if that's the way that he goes, which is absolutely what we expect, It would change the dynamics of the campaign, and particularly for the outside who haven't landed on one obvious leader, it would be a very significant fillip for them, a real shot in the arm. We are finally going to hear from Boris at 10 o'clock this evening. He's going to lay out his arguments in his regular paper column in the Telegraph. But the surprise would be if he decided to stay in. But of course, you never know with Boris Johnson. He's an unpredictable character, and instinctively, many people who know him well say actually at heart, he is a Europhile. He's not somebody who's naturally a sceptic.
Theatrical to the end, of course, as one would expect. Just briefly, though, how is it going to play out now between cabinet ministers on either side? Are they really going to be able to hold it together over the weeks of campaigning?
Well, one of the extraordinary things about this, of course, is that we have official division, an officially divided cabinet, and the normal way of politics working is that they have to stick together come hell or high water. I think most people are going to do their best to be polite, but I think friendships are going to be tested, loyalties are going to be tested, but clearly what it does mean is there's not very much going to be going on around here apart from this. All of the focus is going to be about Europe. The challenge for David Cameron, whatever the result, is whether or not he can keep the party together after the vote.
Laura Kuenssberg, thank you. So, after a near sleepless night on Friday, European leaders were meant to agree a deal over a civilised English breakfast. No such luck. Brunch was mooted, then lunch. It's all about the meals. They didn't bother with afternoon tea. In the end, they came up trumps over dinner. Here's our Adam.
History starts with a lot of waiting around, as I discovered on Friday.
At least it's not raining.
Waiting for news from the EU summit, Westminster had ground to a halt.
You sniffing out any news from Brussels?
Over there, European leaders were on their second day of wrangling. The French president was worried about the City of London getting a special deal. The Polish Prime Minister feared her citizens living in the UK would lose their benefits. And the Greek PM was concerned about migrants. David Cameron said he was battling for a better deal for Britain, which involved lots of talk, quite a few croissants, but not a great deal of action. Suddenly back at Westminster, a thing happened. One of the Leave campaign's Grassroots Out held a rally where it was rumoured they would reveal a surprise supporter.
Who would be like your dream Eurosceptic special guest?
Oh, for me, probably Douglas Carswell.
Sorry, it was actually George Galloway.
Comrades and friends.
When he turned up, a bunch of people left.
Anywhere near it. They don't want him
It was all going so well.
Anglican friends.
Do you often have that effect?
No, they didn't.
It looks pretty busy to me.
About 50 people got up and left.
No, they didn't. They were waiting. There were people who waited for Nigel and had to get trains. Honestly.
Okay.
Clutching at straws.
Okay.
The only thing more exciting was happening back in Brussels, where finally a deal designed to keep Britain in the EU was done over dinner. The hacks were briefed by a clearly knackered Prime Minister.
Good evening and welcome. Within the last hour, I've negotiated a deal to give the United Kingdom special status inside the European Union.
In the midst of it all, Angela Merkel was snapped going for some chips,
Thanks very much. Thank you. Oh, they look delicious. Thank you.
which seemed like a jolly good idea.
That's what I call a working dinner.
Night all. Now it's Saturday morning in Downing Street. More waiting. This time for the first cabinet meeting on a weekend since the Falklands, and David Cameron's chance to brief his colleagues on that deal.
This is the deal, and here's what it amounts to. In a future EU treaty, the EU will exempt the UK from the idea of ever closer union. There's going to be safeguards for the City of London. When it comes to in-work benefits, the UK will be able to apply the emergency brake, which means EU migrants won't get the same level as the rest of us until they've been here for a few years. And from 2020, they'll only get child benefit paid at the rate they would get in their home country.
Time for ministers to give their verdicts.
Home Secretary, are you a Romanian? Are you a pair of outers?
Chancellor, I'm guessing you're an inner, aren't you?
Each gave their answer during a 2-hour meeting in Number 10. Then the PM appeared to press the button marked referendum.
The choice is in your hands, but my recommendation is clear. I believe that Britain will be safer, stronger and better off in a reformed European Union.
And apparently it's now totally fine for members of the cabinet to totally disagree.
What was it like when Michael Gove spoke? Was he a bit sad?
Yeah, of course, because he and the Prime Minister, he and the rest of us, we all know each other. I think it's one of the really interesting and remarkable things about this government is that we all know each other and we like each other and we are friends. We have each other's mobile phones and we text and talk to each other.
Please join me in welcoming Vote Leave's
But the 6 Tory ministerial outers headed straight to the HQ of the Vote Leave campaign.
It's Ian Duncan Smith. I'm a member of the Cabinet.
Free at last to point to the exit.
I will be voting to leave the EU because I am profoundly optimistic about the UK. I believe that we can flourish outside the European Union. So I think the better option is to take back control and restore the ability to make our own laws and control our own borders in this country.
Happy, happy, happy. Here we go. Big smiles.
Now the referendum campaign will be brought to a street near you, like the Britain Stronger in Europe team did in rainy Bath this weekend. There is one more thing we're waiting for. Which side will Boris Johnson join? The Mayor of London will reveal his intentions tonight.
Exciting. Let's pick up on that point. Tom Newton-Dunn, is he going to campaign to come out?
It looks very much like it, yes. The people very close to him this morning I've spoken to, some very pro-European MPs who were really hoping he was going to go their way, have now resigned themselves to Boris going for leave. And apparently it was all down to this great big dinner he had with Michael Gove on Tuesday night, as revealed by the Mail on Sunday this morning. And there it was that Boris was really given an argument he found very hard to refuse, and it would certainly appear they've done a deal to do this together.
Right, isn't it more about leadership ambitions than it is about his true feelings to do with the EU?
Well, I think everybody now is going to presume that, not least because Boris Johnson is a known inner, throughout Westminster and really so throughout his career. He's an internationalist, he was born in New York, he spent time living in Brussels, but he's always been one for reform, but not one for leaving. And he was telling people privately, quite openly, only a month ago, he's going to campaign for in. So he's clearly worked out that the electorate that matters here for him, it would appear, are the grassroots Tories and the MPs who are sceptical and who will, therefore, hopefully, propel him towards being Prime Minister. But the flaw he's got is, does he look sincere in doing this? So he's going to have to make an extremely good argument, I think, tonight to make it sound credible why he has done this quite apparent volte-face.
Right, well, I mean, that will be a boost for the Out campaign. Let's talk about some of the substance, though, Melanie Phillips, because there are people who say, actually, not that many people out in the voting public will look at the fine detail. They'll do it on gut instinct. They'll do it on emotion. Do you think that's true, or do you think there are salient issues that could capture the imagination?
I think the two are not necessarily in contradiction to each other. I think gut instinct and emotion are very much part of it. And fear will play a great deal to do with this, have a great deal to do with this campaign. The fear of, we must cling on to nurse for fear of something worse, which is what the Prime Minister has been and will continue to play on very significantly. But I was just very struck by this morning's interview with the Prime Minister, in which he addressed what for me is the most important issue, which is sovereignty, and he redefined it. He redefined it. He was so keen to slip away from it because it's so dangerous for him. The argument is that Britain will still have no control over its own laws, that the laws of this country will be dictated in significant measure, if not in great measure.
Although he said there would be a mechanism. He said they are looking at a mechanism to try and look at a way of making UK laws.
He is clinging to his apparent concession that he's wrung out of them, not to sign up to ever closer union. That is a meaningless thing. The thing is that we in Britain will continue to be bound by the judgments of the European Court of Justice. And although the Prime Minister has floated some kind of constitutional settlement, this is a nonsense, because there is nothing that can override that superiority while we continue to be signed up to the EU.
But it's interesting that opponents of the European Union are very and understandably vexed that we appear not have the ability to make our own laws, but don't seem to be vexed that we appear not to have the ability to decide whether we go to war or not. You could have a situation in the next few months where Turkey and Syria could find, that Russia and Turkey could find themselves at war. What happens then? We are then bound to go to war on Turkey's behalf because Turkey is a member of NATO. And opponents of the European Union don't seem to be too vexed about that, but they are vexed about lawmaking. And that will be an argument that I think the Prime Minister will make.
Do you think security will be the overriding thing that will convince people then?
Well, it's really simple who's going to win this campaign. The winners of this campaign will be the safest option and the losers will be the riskiest option. And that's why the Prime Minister, every other word is talking about risk, is talking about uncertainty, is saying, what can you, the outers, what is your vision for what Britain will be like outside the European Union?
We're going to hear more from you later on in the programme. And as we've been hearing, as soon as David Cameron announced the date of the referendum, members of the Cabinet were given free rein to campaign on either side of the argument. So who will be campaigning to stay in and who will be campaigning to leave? So the deal's been done. It's time for ministers to pick a side. No surprises that David Cameron, George Osborne and Philip Hammond will all campaign to stay in. And they'll be pleased that potential outers, Theresa May, Liz Truss and Sajid Javid, have also all opted for the Remain team. So what about their opposition? Chris Grayling, Priti Patel, John Whittingdale, Theresa Villiers and Ian Duncan Smith will be campaigning to leave. And they will be cheered that Michael Gove, after much soul-searching, has also plucked for the Leave camp. However, there's one big name waiting on the sidelines. Boris Johnson. Pollsters claim his support could sway a lot of voters. Surely it can't be long to wait now. And the leader of the House of Commons, Chris Grayling, is with us now. Welcome.
Hello there.
Why don't you think the deal that the Prime Minister secured was enough?
Well, the Prime Minister's made some progress in his discussions in Brussels. I think we all give him credit for that. But does this represent a transformation that would say to me we should stay within the European Union? No, it doesn't. I think our membership of the European Union holds us back. I think there are decisions that we should be taking in the interests of our country that we cannot take because of our membership of the EU, like the ability to decide how many people come and live and work here, like the ability to forge free trade deals around the world. And we are spending £350 million a week in subscriptions to the EU that could and should be spent on the National Health Service or bringing down our debts.
Although some of that, of course, doesn't take into account the rebate that the UK gets. So in your mind, the Prime Minister has failed in his ambition to secure fundamental reform?
I think what we've discovered, the Prime Minister's worked immensely hard at this.
But he failed, in your mind.
What he has brought back is a deal that he and others believe is sufficient for us to stay in the European Union. I don't. I think we should leave the European Union. That's going to be the essence of the debate for the next few months.
What could he have secured to get your support?
Well, I think there are key questions about our membership of the European Union, and you talked a moment ago about risk. You know, take the example of the ability to control our borders and particularly to set limits on the number of people who come and live and work here. All of the national statisticians are saying our population is on the way to rising to 75 or 80 million people. I don't think we can cope with that as a nation. I don't think we have the houses, I don't think we have the school places, I don't think we have the hospitals.
And your government has failed to do anything about the net migration figures, hasn't it?
Just letting that happen is a huge risk to us. And one of the reasons we can't do anything about it is because of the free movement rules in the European Union.
All right, if we didn't have free movement of people, what level of migration would be acceptable to you?
Well, we set a goal of bringing migration down to the tens of thousands. It's been in our last two manifestos.
What is it now? 330,000. You're saying that if the UK pulled out of the EU, you would, within a year, get levels of tens of thousands?
Well, we would have the ability to set limits, to look at the reality of the migration pressures we face, look at where we do have skills needs. We could take decisions in the interests of Britain. At the moment, we cannot do that.
Right. So there isn't anything that David Cameron could have secured to get your support, because you always wanted to come out of the EU?
I've believed for a long time that it was very likely I would decide to come out of the EU. I've sat through European meetings for 5 years. I do not believe we are properly able to look after our national interest, to look after our businesses, to look after our citizens. I think too many decisions have been passed to Brussels. Michael Gove rightly yesterday talked about the number of changes that cross all of our desks as ministers that make a real difference to the people of this country.
Give me one example that's come across your desk or in your former job, came across your desk that you couldn't enact because of the EU.
Well, I found, for example, in the arena of health and safety when I was Minister previously, there were changes being brought in that were going to cost British business money.
Which ones did you not want to bring in? Which health? Because you always talk about regulations, Chris Grayling, and so do other Eurosceptic ministers. But which specific bills were you not able to pass, or which laws were foisted on you by the EU?
Well, I would not have imposed massive change to the North Sea oil industry, for example, which has the best safety record in the world. It took 3 years of intense negotiations to reduce a package that would have been damaging to one that simply costs extra money for the industry.
Because you want to strip away health and safety regulations.
Well, we had the best safety regime in the world. There was no need to change things.
You've used that example. Across the board, you'd like to get rid of health and safety regulations that are brought in as a result of not just our government, but also the EU.
Well, I want us as a nation to be able to decide what health and safety rules we want in the UK, not to have them imposed on us by other countries. I want less regulation. I want the right regulation. I want proper safety in the workplace, but I don't want huge extra burdens put on business.
What was the atmosphere like in the Cabinet yesterday?
It was very cordial. It was a very, I think, constructive meeting. It was a very friendly meeting. The Prime Minister immediately accepted that we had different views around the table, but we all committed to working in the next few months for the cause that we believe in, on one side or the other, but in a constructive and friendly way.
But you won't be able to do that because it'll be dominated by this issue, won't it? I mean,
but we can have that debate in an amicable way. We don't have to attack each other personally.
Really? But
we don't have to insult each other.
You only have to look at the headlines in the newspapers. It's already happening. You've already said that the Prime Minister is scaremongering, that there's going to be Project Fear, as have your colleagues. That isn't friendly and cordial.
Well, I haven't actually said the Prime Minister scaremongering.
You have implied that those issues where he's saying
actually,
too risky to leave.
The organisation I criticised this morning was EasyJet, who have been arguing that somehow cheap airfares would disappear from Europe. That's nonsense. We have cheap airlines all around the world, inside the EU, outside the EU. There are regional airports in continental Europe that would go bust if it wasn't for low-cost aviation from the United Kingdom. It is just simply not true.
Really? And you know that you can guarantee that, can you, to the British people, that all these things will be there the day after Britain votes to leave the EU?
Why would people in continental Europe cost themselves money? It's like the trade argument.
But you can't guarantee it, can you? You can't guarantee it.
Ask yourself the question. Do you think on the day after Britain leaves the European Union, the Germans will say, we are no longer going to sell BMWs to the British? It's not going to happen. It's
all right,
fantasy.
well, let's talk about the trade deal. There will be a trade deal, you're absolutely right, for the reasons you've outlined. Countries will want to have and trade with the UK. The issue is, will it be the same deal? Will there be full access for the UK to the same markets for goods and for services? Are you saying that actually there will be this utopia where the same deal will be struck, we won't have to be part of freedom of movement rules, and we won't have to pay a penny towards the EU? Is that what you're saying to the British people?
Well, we run a massive trade deficit with the European Union. We are their most important customer.
That question, can you guarantee that we will have full access to trade and services in the way that exists now, without freedom of movement and without paying into a
We need to ask the question the other way around.
Well,
why would they take a risk with jobs in Germany and France and other European countries by not agreeing a proper, modern, free trade agreement in goods and services? They run a massive trade surplus with us. They sell far more to us than we sell to them. They lose out financially if those trading arrangements do not continue.
Right.
Why would they take that risk?
I'm not saying that the trading arrangements wouldn't continue. They would continue. I'm talking about the terms. Everyone says we don't know what out would look like. And what I'm trying to get from you is, how long would it take? Would it take a year, 2 years, or 7 years like Canada? And would it be on the same terms that we have now?
Well, why would it not be on a free trade basis? Because it costs them money if it's not. It's not us that loses financially if we don't have a free trade agreement. It's Germany and France and other European countries. And that's why, of course, there will be a free trade agreement that allows all our businesses to trade freely to and from continental
All our
Europe.
businesses. And how long do you think that would take?
Well, I think it will take a very relatively short period of time, in my view, because they lose financially.
Well, how long would it take? If it took Canada 7 years, how long do you think it would take the UK?
Well, there's a process of negotiation that is set out in the treaty that is estimated to take 2 years. I would not expect for a moment those countries to take a risk that at the end of 2 years they would lose out financially.
Well,
it's not us, it's they lose out financially.
Well, even over the negotiations, they have said, particularly President Hollande, that actually he's not going to give special treatment to Great Britain, why would these countries who've been pulled through the ringer over these negotiations then suddenly want to immediately, on your timescale, set up favourable terms of trade with the UK?
But does anybody seriously think that President Hollande is going to say to French farmers, who we know are a fairly lively bunch when they want to be, you will no longer have free trade agreements to sell your wine and your cheese and your other agricultural products to British supermarkets? Why on earth would he take that political risk?
But we don't know the terms. I mean, that you admit. We don't know exactly what the terms. We don't know exactly what time. We know what you would like, and we know you're saying you can't believe there would be another option. But it is a risk, isn't it? That's what the Prime Minister has said. It's a risk, and he's right.
It is a risk for the French
No,
not to have a
Sajid
free trade
Javid-
agreement with us, because otherwise their businesses lose out.
Sajid Javid doesn't agree with you, and he is the business secretary. Is he wrong when he says that actually my head says it's just too risky now for business?
Well, I think the risk is on the other side.
Is
we
he
run
wrong?
a big...
Is Sajid Javid wrong to say the risk is too great now?
I have a different view to Sajid, because we run a huge trade deficit with continental Europe. They are the ones who lose if we do not have a free trade agreement with them.
You've said that, but he is, you know, contradicting you, or you are contradicting him. He is the business secretary. What do you know that he doesn't?
Well, we have different views around the cabinet table, and we set those out yesterday. Some of us are in, some of us are out, and we will have that debate, that argument over the next few months. But we will do it in a constructive way. Sajid is a very good business secretary. Sajid is also very clear in his article this morning that he's deeply unhappy about the European Union. We have fallen on different sides of the
He's campaigning
argument.
to remain. He's being loyal to the Prime Minister.
Well, we have taken different views in this. We're both loyal to the Prime Minister as Prime Minister.
Well, you're not loyal to the Prime Minister on this issue, are you?
The Prime Minister has been very clear in saying that government ministers are free to take different sides in this argument, and I really respect him for that. It's a bold decision, it's a brave decision, it's the right decision, and I'm glad he's done it.
If you lose the argument, the referendum, are you worried about your job?
I think that's irrelevant. This is
Why?
about principle.
It's only going to happen on June the 23rd. One could easily see a situation where David Cameron, who feels very strongly about this, will say to you and your colleagues who are campaigning out, that's it, it's over.
David Cameron will decide the construct of his government in the future in his own way and for what he believes is right. This is a matter of principle for me. It's not about my career, it's not about my job, it's because I believe it's the right thing for the country.
So you're prepared to lose your job over this, rightly or wrongly?
Well, I think it's immaterial. I'm doing what I believe is the right thing for the country. What happens to me in ministerial terms, in job terms, is neither here nor there. I'm doing this because I believe it's the right thing for the country. And I also believe it's the low-risk option for the country.
Is it the right thing for the country, for the government, a Conservative majority government, for the first time in many years, fighting and split and divided over this issue?
I think it is... people expect a mature democracy. They expect us as politicians to be grown up, to debate, to discuss. They don't expect us to agree all the time. We're not automatons. We're being very open and saying, we disagree on this. We're going to have a constructive debate over the next few months, but we're going to stay friends. We're going to stay respectful of the Prime Minister, and we're going to work together to make sure we carry on governing the country well.
If you win, does the Prime Minister have to go?
Absolutely not.
Right.
It would be absolutely the wrong thing to happen.
So you trust him totally to renegotiate bilateral trade agreements with the EU as the Prime Minister who campaigned to stay in the EU?
I trust him as the Prime Minister who was bold enough to give the country the choice. If the country decides to leave, then he will lead us out. If the country decides to stay, he will lead us in government on to 2020 and carrying on the programme that will make a difference to the country.
He would really be your favoured person to lead those negotiations. You'd still trust him after all this?
I would still trust him.
Either way, in terms of your colleagues, do you think it would be possible for him to stay?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think the last thing we need at the end of all of this, whether we vote to leave or whether we vote to stay, is a political bloodbath. You know, we've got a good team. That team needs to carry on and do what the country asks us to do.
How big a boost would Boris Johnson be to your campaign?
I think it would be great if he joined the Leave campaign. I hope he will. I know no more than anybody else does about what his intentions are, but I hope he will.
And if you lose, is that it? Will this issue be settled?
Well, the people will decide it, so I don't think we can return to it. You never know what's going to happen in a generation's time, but I don't think any of us are going to be arguing for another referendum next year and the year after and the year after that.
Right, I mean, is that it, though, for a generation?
I think the people of this country will have decided if we vote to stay in the European Union, we stay. If we vote to leave the European Union, we leave.
Chris Grayling, thank you.
That's where we leave the team in London. Hello and welcome to the Sunday Politics Wales. On this momentous weekend, what does the EU referendum mean for Wales? How would we be affected if the UK left, and what are the reasons for remaining? And Carwyn Jones says he wants 5 more years to finish the work he began, but has he done enough to inspire his party at their last conference before the Assembly election? But first, now we know. In just 4 months' time, we'll get the chance to do something that hasn't been on offer for more than 40 years in this country, to decide whether we want to leave or remain in the European Union. The campaign seems to have been going on for months, but now it's expected to hot up. But how does being a member of the EU affect us here in Wales?
The EU is often called the biggest trading bloc in the world, one big marketplace.
So we're better to discuss Wales's place in the EU than in our biggest indoor market. And the people that sell stuff here, well, they've got a view on pretty much anything anyway. Now, the vast majority of meat from Wales is exported to the EU, and according to the Welsh Government, the red meat market alone is worth around £175 million a year. Now, if the UK left the EU, that market would still be there, of course, but what isn't clear is what exactly the terms of the trade would be.
This butcher's is run by a married couple with very different views when it comes to the European Union.
I think we do need it, but he has to make the changes. And if he doesn't stand his ground, we're done for.
The sovereignty comes into it with me. Basically, trade has got nothing to do with me. But the way I look at it, they want our stuff, and we want their stuff. So, go back to the way we were before.
Farmers get their share of around £200 million of European funding a year, so the average dairy farmer gets around £22,000, with the average sheep farmer getting around £19,000 a year. One gripe we've heard here today is about immigration, because any EU citizen can come to live in Wales.
When we look at immigration, it is worth bearing in mind that Wales is a part of the UK with the lowest proportion of people born abroad. But people do come here to live, and the two countries at the top of the list are both from within the EU, Poland and Ireland.
Parts of Wales, like Swansea, also benefit from EU grant aid for poorer countries. It's worth almost £2 billion between 2014 and 2020, helping to create thousands of jobs. Opponents say it's not European money, it's our money, and if we didn't have to send funds to the EU every year, it could come from the UK government. Supporters of the EU, though, say there's no guarantee a UK government would keep giving so much money to Wales.
If they leave, I suppose, like, it will just tell every other sort of major player, i.e. Germany and stuff like that, to just cause them to leave. And if they all leave, it just might bring instability in the whole economic front.
The EU regulates how much fishing there is off the coast of Wales. Now, it's designed to protect fish stocks, but fishermen here say it can damage their industry.
Everybody puts sanctions in then, apart from us, and they would like to fish our waters virtually dry. So that's the way they stand. I mean, we should be allowed to do that ourselves.
Opponents say if we left the EU, there would be much more freedom to trade with emerging export markets like India and China, rather than having to go through Brussels. So it's clear the debate is heating up, but until there's agreement in Brussels and a date for the vote, the campaign is still on ice.
The view there from Swansea. Well, joining me now are two people from either side of the argument. The Chief Executive of Leave EU, Liz Bilney, and the Lib Dem AM, Eluned Parrott, who's with Britain Stronger in Europe. Thank you both for joining us this morning. First of all, to you then, Liz Bilney. I mean, give me your pitch. Why would the UK be better out of the EU?
Well, the UK would be better off out of the EU because we could really take control of our laws, finances and our trade. We'd be able to negotiate our own trade agreements with the likes of Japan and China and even re-establish our links with the Commonwealth. In terms of taking control of our laws, we could put in place appropriate policies such as migration. We could look to an Australian-style system, which we all agree is fair and unbiased, and we could welcome people from all over the world.
Yeah, Eluned Parrott, why would the UK be better to remain in the EU?
It's a nonsense to suggest that the EU prevents us from trading from the rest of the world. 56% of our trade is with the rest of the world. However, for me, the most compelling reason why we shouldn't leave Europe is the European Union has given us 60 years of peace in a continent that's known 2,000 years of uninterrupted war. I am not going to gamble with my children's future. I am going to vote with my heart to stay in and to keep talking to our neighbours and our friends.
That point then about the peace element of it. I mean, if the UK did decide to leave the EU, the EU would still be there. That element of peaceful cooperation on mainland continental Europe would still be there, wouldn't it?
it would still be there, but we wouldn't be a part of it. And I think that we would be so much weaker if we weren't a part of that union. We helped to create a system whereby we talk to our neighbours to help prevent what happened in the First and Second World Wars, where these multilateral military-only agreements that we had build us into the First World War, because we toppled into those situations.
Liz Bilney, you want to come in on that?
Yes. I would suggest that we're a member of the wrong club in that case, because we're a member of NATO and we're a member of the UN Security Council. We also have seats on G7, G8 and G20, which help countries communicate and pass information. So we do have the right security in place. We're great friends with the USA. We don't need to be part of the EU if security is our main concern.
And yet, as David Cameron was, when he was talking to the BBC this morning, was saying the UK is a country which likes to be part of organisations, as you're saying, in NATO, in the UN. Why not be part of this huge, single market, the biggest single market in the world, and so on? Why not be in there, able to influence things?
The EU costs us £350 million a week. It's an outdated club that doesn't give us any benefits in return. We do have the seats at the right table. When you look at trade, we are part of the World Trade Organization. So we have the right membership in different clubs. So why are we paying all this money?
Well, let's look at trade then. I mean, this element of if the UK leaves the EU, what will the nature of the trading relationship between the UK and the rest of the EU be?
Okay, to take it right down to basics, we buy more from the EU than we sell. So when we look at the last trade deficit figures, £80 billion of deficit sat there, and £50 billion is with the EU.
Right, but tell me what will, if in the event of the UK leaving, we know what the situation is now, but in the event of the UK leaving...
Trade won't change. We will still go into the supermarkets and we'll buy...
You can guarantee that trade won't change?
People will still want to buy French wine, people will still want to buy BMW cars, Hoovers. Trade will not change, and because of that, there'll be no impact on jobs.
Why do you say it won't change? Because you don't know that, and the only
because we still want to buy the same trading, we still want to buy the same products, and we still want to sell the same services. So you would come to a natural agreement, and you have a seat at the World Trade Organization that sets the table for that.
A natural agreement? That doesn't sound like anything cast iron. And if you look at, for example, Canada is a country trying to have its own free trade agreement with the EU at the moment. That's taking 7 years. So
Iceland,
are you talking there's going to be sort of 7 years?
And Iceland, a country of 350,000 people, negotiated its own trade agreement with China. So are you suggesting we're not strong enough and big enough to be able to put in place our own?
That was an argument I heard from Nigel Farage this morning. But there's a difference, isn't there? I mean, Iceland is a very small country. The UK is a fifth largest economy in the world, trading with all these different countries in the EU. China's one country. The EU is obviously a different animal in that respect. How can you guarantee we'll have a similar trade nature with the EU?
Because we buy more from the EU than we sell. So when we come to the table and they want to carry on that trading relationship, the cards are in our hands.
There we are, the cards are in our hands. It gives us the freedom to sort of have a better deal for us. How can you argue against that?
That's just a fairy tale, isn't it? How is it logical to say that it's OK to be part of some clubs but not part of other clubs? That's just a nonsense, isn't it? There's no logical basis for that. When you think about the trading relationship with Europe, yes, we'll still trade with Europe, but there may well be tariffs in place, there may well be costs. We won't trade at the same cost, the same price, with the same ease. Otherwise, if there is no difference in the trading relationship, why on earth do you want to leave? What on earth is the difference? There will be change, there will be risk, and there will be difference. And independent estimates reckon that UK consumers will pay £3,000 a year more for services and goods that we buy from the European Union, such as flights, such as roaming charges on mobile tariffs, and all of those kind of things, which are being lowered as a result of our membership of the EU. And can I ask you a question? I mean, if you're looking for a new relationship, let's have a look at the relationships that do exist for countries that are in Europe but not in the EU. For example, Norway or Switzerland. Are you basing your arguments on a model that they follow?
No, I think we're more complex than that. I don't think you can take one country. You can take elements of what different countries have, but I think it's a very simplistic way of looking at the world to say, let's take the Norway option, let's take this option. You can take elements of different countries and we can come up with our own unique structure which will reflect our own demographic, social, economic makeup, which makes us different, and that's why we need to be out.
Are you honestly saying to me that you can't describe to me the model of the new relationship you want to broker? You want to tell me you want to broker a new relationship with Europe, but you can't tell me what that looks like, and you want the voters of this country to say, we'll throw away what we have for an unknown future, for an uncertain future, for a future that's risky for our children. I want my children to grow up in a world where they've got jobs to go to.
Let's let Elizabeth answer the question before
I would suggest that staying in the EU is the unknown. We have seen the EU evolve from what it has in 1975 to what it is today. We joined the common market, and now it's the disunion that's called the EU. And that will progress into a bigger state of disunion, and we're seeing the decline of the euro, so the whole thing in 2 years could even collapse itself. So I would suggest it's better to start building outside of the EU, build up our trade relationships, make friends with the Commonwealth, the guys that we left behind, and start to negotiate our own trade agreements, and we can be stronger and we will prospect out. We find the prospect of coming out exciting.
Elizabeth Parrott, you said just then the average consumer in the UK would be £3,000 a year worse off for goods and services. Why do you say that?
There are basically cost savings to be had by the fact that there are no tariffs and no import charges, and there are also things like, for example...
But you don't know what those will be.
It's been estimated by the CDI.
We've calculated it the other way around. So we've calculated that it will be £3,000 better off by coming out. So there are figures going both ways.
We'll finish with Elizabeth Parrott, then we'll come back to why you think it'll be better off.
The kind of things that are cheaper for consumers as a result of the EU are food, because obviously we have a system which supports the farming industry to give us food security. So food is the main one, which is likely to be more expensive. As a result, there are then things like flights within Europe because of agreements between the airline industry and the European Union. There are things like roaming charges for mobile phones and making sure that there are access to mobile networks overseas. There's all sorts of things, but the average cost to British consumers if we leave the EU is around about £3. It's £3,000 a year, it's estimated.
So you're saying it's going to be £3,000 a year better off. Why do you say that?
Well, let's take it back. If we're not in the EU, we will be saving £55 million per day. That money we...
Well, yeah, that doesn't take into account the fact that there is a UK rebate which does come in. So it's closer to £45 million a day. But
OK, that's still a lot of money. That's still a lot of money. That could still help towards putting money into schools, hospitals, and make this country much greater. It's a huge, huge cost saving for our economy.
But it's not for farmers in Wales. I mean, farmers in Wales, best part of 15,000 farmers in Wales, we were talking that report there, get around £20,000 a year in EU subsidies.
Yes.
They'll lose that, won't they?
Only if the government chooses not to give it back.
So it's not a guarantee, it's an uncertainty, isn't it?
But that's a whole different issue. That's saying that you don't trust the fact that the government will give us the rebate back.
It's not trust, it's just a lack of certainty, isn't it, for the farmers?
No, I think you're just gambling that it's better to have a bird in the hand than a bird in the bush. But we know that we can sort ourselves out and be better off by being out. There will be huge, huge cost savings coming out. Jobs will be unaffected. There is lots of myths and fallacies on the Inside campaign that we're here to present the facts, and we know that once people see the real information that they will vote to come out of the EU.
There we are. This is the first of what will be many, many debates to come. Thank you both for coming in this morning. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Now, in the middle of this huge story of an EU referendum, do spare a thought for Welsh Labour, trying to set out their stall for the Assembly elections. Maybe Lynette won't. The party, of course, has led the government in Wales since we've had an Assembly 17 years ago, and it's fair to say it's been a mixed bag as far as some services go, ministers admitting to having taken their eye off the ball in education, for example. Well, a political editor, Nick Savini, has been at the party's annual conference in Llandudno and spoke to the leader, Carwyn Jones, and he began by asking him what he made of the European deal.
Look, I can live with what's been proposed. I think the important thing for me is not necessarily the deal, but the principle that Wales should be part of the UK and the EU to get access to that big single market that sustains so many jobs in Wales.
And yet it's a very almost, and also Jeremy Corbyn as well today, a kind of mealy-mouthed acceptance of this referendum. I mean, it could be really tight. And, you know, a bit of old-fashioned tribal party politics is maybe not what's required here if you really want the UK to remain in the EU.
The problem is, if with the referendum in June and an election in May, it makes it kind of difficult to separate the two. Now, we'll run an election campaign, and the European campaign will be something different. But the problem we've got is that for those of us who want Wales to remain part of the EU, we have an election up to the 5th of May, and then all the parties will be on their knees in terms of energy levels, in terms of money, and then have 6 weeks to craft a campaign to persuade the people of Wales to remain.
Yeah, there's a real sort of logistical difficulty here, isn't it? I've spoken to people today who said, senior Labour figures said to me, you should have a pact with the other parties whereby you don't talk about the EU because it gets in the way of the Assembly campaign. This is just unrealistic, isn't it?
Well, I'm not going to be talking about the EU as a central part of our campaign. I'll be talking about health, education and the economy. Yes, the EU is important for the strength of our economy, that much is true, but we shouldn't conflate the EU referendum with the Assembly election campaign. You know, let's be realistic. Of course the two of them are going to run into each other at different stages, but it's not something that I'll be looking to do.
Right, let's talk about your speech and let's talk about the Assembly campaign. Interesting, I thought, it was very personal at times. You had your wife as the warm-up act.
You make it sound as if I made her do it. She volunteered.
Right,
Yeah.
But, you know, there was definitely a kind of a personal element, and I wonder, and particularly in terms of the content, you talked essentially of this being a fight between who you want as First Minister, yourself or Andrew R.T. Davies. I get a sense that this is going to be a very presidential-style campaign. Is that what you want here?
Well, there are two things. First of all, we stand on what we've done and on what we're going to do. 2011, we made promises, we've kept them all. And so what we're saying to the people of Wales in 2016 is we will keep the promises that we make in 2016.
Yeah, but
it's right to say, it's right to say, in the age we live in, of course people look at party leaders, and of course they will judge them according to whether they think that they're up to the job that they're aspiring to get. So, yeah, there is an element of people looking at party leaders. They want to see who they think will look the part as First Minister. That's inevitable. It's not enough on its own. You've also got to have the policies, but the two run together.
In terms of policies, what are you going to do about hospital waiting lists if you're in power after May?
See them come down even more. We're seeing, for example, delayed transfers of care dropping in Wales. They're going up in England, what people call bed blocking. We're seeing cancer figures doing better than England. There are some areas of the NHS we want to see improvements, that much is true.
You know as well as I do, most hospital waiting lists are longer in Wales than they are in England, of the key indicators.
Some are, some aren't, that's true. We know, though,
most of them,
that the OECD produced a report last Friday that said that there was no difference between the English and the Welsh NHS.
Didn't look at waiting times, then. Didn't look. You can't decouple.
But
you can't change.
It looked at what was being delivered through the different health services. We've had to sit here and listen to the Tories, both within Wales and outside, saying the Welsh NHS is worse than the English NHS. It isn't. We've got no junior doctor strike, for example. I mean, what's happening at the moment, the chaos in the NHS in England, we don't want to see imported into Wales.
It is on waiting times, First Minister. It's worse than England on waiting times.
There's work to do with some waiting times, not all of them, with some waiting times. Not cancer, where we do better.
Not
that
on
much
cancer,
is true.
but most of them.
You're right to say that there are some areas we want to see improvement continue. We're seeing it with ambulance response times, and we need to see more of it happening with waiting times. That's true.
So what will you do to try to change things? What's the policy? What is it? More of the same, because it hasn't worked so far.
Well, it's making sure that we continue to put resources into the NHS. Demand goes up all the time, and the NHS is not far away from being half our budget now. Demand goes up, and the challenge, as it will be in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, is to make sure that the resources are there to meet demand.
You covered a lot of ground in that speech. I thought it was interesting, no mention of the M4 Relief Road. It's only the biggest construction project that will be carried out since the start of devolution. Are you going cool on it?
No, there has to be an M4 Relief Road.
Right, OK. But you didn't mention it. Why? Is there tension in the party?
There are lots of things. I mean, there are several things I didn't mention in the speech. You shouldn't read anything into that. We have a manifesto yet that we haven't yet published. But
it'll be in the manifesto,
there has to be an M4 Relief Road, yes.
And it'll be in the manifesto?
Yes.
You talked about taking the flak for difficult decisions.
Yeah.
I want to take you back to a speech you gave to the NHS Confederation a couple of weeks ago, and you said, and I quote, "It's impossible to spend more on the NHS and on councils, and anyone who says otherwise risks taking the Welsh public for fools." So what are you saying there? Are you prepared to take the flak here that a new administration under you, the priority will be the NHS and there will be less money available for council
that was aimed at other parties, particularly the Tories, because I stand up in the chamber every week and I'm being told to put more money into health, more into education, more into local government, more into flood defences. You can't do it all. It's Cloud Cuckooland economics. So that was aimed particularly at the Tories, who seem to think that there's a magic money tree somewhere and the difficult decisions don't have to be taken. But we know because they publish their own figures. They want to cut education spending by 12%, local government by 12%. So that's a 38% increase in council tax. Spending on job creation by 30%. Cutting spending on housing. I mean, that's what they stand for.
But in terms of your spending plans then, what you've said quite explicitly there is you cannot increase NHS and councils. Now, presumably, you made it very clear in that speech, you are going to keep increasing spending on the NHS.
Yep.
So it's a tough message for councils then. Council spending will have... You're just not going to be able to afford.
You seem to think this is a message that I was giving on behalf of our party. It was aimed at other parties. They claim you can do both. You're right to say that as we find more resources for the NHS, that yes, we have to find those resources from elsewhere, and that's where, of course, the difficult decisions do come in.
Yeah, it sounded to me like it's one or the other.
No,
we're not
looking to raid council budgets, which seems to be the suggestion there. That isn't the case. When we look at where to find money, we look, for example, at schemes that are coming to an end that we may have funded. We look at rationalising things, and sometimes, we have to take very difficult decisions where funding is cut in certain areas. I mean, because there's a limited pot of money, it's inevitable that should happen. But what we tried to do is to prioritise our spending according to what we think the people of Wales would want.
You've talked about a 10-year plan. We're halfway through it. What is there left to do? What have you failed to achieve in the first 5 years that needs to be done in the second?
It's not failing. What happens is you spend 5 years delivering for people, you get ideas on what you could do next. It's not a sign of failure, it's a sign of learning for the future. We've come up with 6 pledges to help older people, help people who need childcare, those who want training, those in the NHS, education. These are the areas that we think are important for the people of Wales. They're pledges that are costed. We know we can deliver them. They're pledges that we think are understandable, and they're pledges that will make a real difference to people's lives.
10-year plan. Are you going to be First Minister for that 10-year plan?
I want to be First Minister after May. That's my immediate plan. Look, I think it's wrong of politicians to say, I plan to be there for a certain amount of time. What I want to do is to convince the people of Wales to vote for my party and to put me back in as First Minister after May.
First Minister, thanks very much.
There we are, Nick Savini talking to Carwyn Jones. I'm very pleased to say Nick's legged it down the A470 from Llandudno to be with us now. I mean, what was the sense that you got from the conference there? It seemed quite upbeat.
It was an enormously busy conference. It would have been intense anyway before an Assembly election. Throw into the mix Jeremy Corbyn, of course. Throw into the mix that as things were unfolding in Llandudno yesterday, we had events at Westminster being played out, and the story was changing every hour about the actual confirmation of the date for the EU referendum. In terms of the set-piece speech from Carwyn Jones, I think there was a view in the room, not just from party hacks, who you would expect to say this, but from a lot of independent observers. It was one of his strongest set-piece speeches that he's given as leader. It opened up this new personal element, as we touched on there. His wife, for goodness sake, was the warm-up act, talking about family holidays and the times that they first met. And then he came in and talked about the aspirations that his mum and dad had for him. So that was introducing a new element. On the kind of fundamental message, Adwyn, of a decade of delivery, the halfway in, we've still got work to do. In other words, give us more time. I think there are pluses and minuses. The clear strength for them on this is that it brings Labour into the here and now. Welsh Labour don't want to be defending failed policies from 2002 in 2016. So it was not a kind of triumphalist, look at our record, 17 years Welsh Labour since devolution came into being. So it comes into the here and now. The risk, though, inevitably, is that it is an appeal for more time. And inevitably, the response from a lot of people will be, well, you've had nearly 20 years, why should we give you more time? And
as you were saying, in the middle of their conference, bless them, comes this huge news that we're going to have a referendum. I mean, what's your take then on how the campaign will go in Wales, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of people are just not ready for it yet. I was in Merthyr last week. I spoke to an awful lot of people in relation to this, and it is striking how many people have just not made up their mind. Now, maybe I should be a bit more specific. They have not had the time to really read up on it and be in a position where they can make an informed choice. Now, I've got a completely unscientific theory on this, and it's the date in the diary theory, which is that once you have a date in the calendar, you then become a lot more focused on the issues that are involved. I think the air war on this in terms of broadcast and newspaper obsession with this over the months ahead will be huge. You know, I don't know if you were born in 1975. I was 3, but the point is, it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. It is going to be a huge story. I think the thing that people really don't know yet is what the ground war is going to be like. On the ground in communities, what is it going to look and feel like?
Is it surprising? I mean, I was in Swansea on Friday looking at the EU, and overall, I'd say probably more people wanting to leave than the Remain. And you think of Swansea as somewhere that's received so many hundreds of millions of pounds of EU state aid funding, structural funding, Objective 1 funding. Does it surprise you, you know, looking at that poll last week, more people in Wales wanting to opt for leave than Remain, and Wales probably being the greatest beneficiary of EU money of the whole of the UK? Yeah,
it's interesting. I think there's been a sense historically that Wales is more pro-European, and there's been some polling research to back that up. And then we had the European elections. We've seen the rise of UKIP in Wales, as strong as many other areas, and now really gunning for the Assembly elections. So in a sense, it's been flipped around. The EU aid issue will give a Welsh dynamic to this picture, because it's so, you know, its presence is everywhere in so many communities, and will have to be addressed by both sides. Yeah.
There's also going to be a bit of an overlap, isn't there, between the referendum and the Assembly election campaign? How are they going to sort of try and deal with that then, do you think?
Oh, I mean, hugely. I mean, at the Labour conference in Llandudno, people are deeply pessimistic about this. Very stern warnings to people like me and other journalists. You have a duty to separate the two. One senior figure even saying that the parties should form a pact and not talk about EU issues for fear of it being a distraction in the Assembly campaign. I mean, I think inevitably that is going to be unrealistic. And when people, Assembly candidates, knock on doors, many people are going to want to know what they think about the EU and not the Assembly.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Neil. That's all from us. Thank you very much, Wylio. Diolch am wylio. Bye-bye.